As we have seen, Adam and Eve are no ordinary couple, and they live in no ordinary circumstances. They live in a utopian environment and in communion with their Creator, a God that is represented anthropomorphically, for the story advances through God's dialogue and interaction with creation. Adam and Eve are represented as being like innocent children, as it says, "And the man and his wife were both naked, and were not ashamed." This is appropriate as they symbolize the birth of the Jewish nation. They are not ashamed because they have no reason to be, since they are righteous in the eyes of God. Also, shame of being naked would imply a division of body and spirit, something which Adam and Eve cannot conceive of at this point. Living in the garden, their existence is a blissful and bountiful one. But paradise is about to meet its first challenge. In chapter 3, the serpent is introduced. The serpent is a much more complex character than it is often given credit for. Some would say that it's Satan in the garden, but this association does not appear until the 1st century with the Book of Enoch and Revelations. For at least 7,000 years before the story of Adam and Eve was composed, which is sometime around 950 BCE, the serpent had been the object of reverence and even worship in the Levant, and had accumulated a multitude of symbolic associations. And it's not hard to see why this is, considering the way a snake can glide with the motion of waves, its lightning-like speed with which it attacks its prey, its power of looking like its environment, its infinite patience and watchfulness, continuing for hours with its head raised, focused on an object that has drawn its attention. But perhaps the qualities most persistently associated with the serpent have been that of immortality and rejuvenation. It was seen as periodically renewing its youth by shedding its skin. Also, the typical pose of a snake is in that of a circle. The circle represents immortality and eternity in many cultures. Because of their nearness to the earth, roots, and herbs, serpents were seen as having a knowledge of medicine, and it's no coincidence that today's modern symbol for medicine is a caduceus, a staff entwined by 2 serpents. This symbol has its origin in a staff belonging to a Greek god known as Asclepius. Asclepius was a legendary figure who was divinized and worshipped in ancient Greece. He was known as the god of physicians, and according to legend, he healed the sick and revived the dead. His staff was perhaps the original walking stick of traveling doctors, but later received symbolic meanings of helpfulness or wisdom. Those serpents were most often affiliated with pagan religion. The Jews' attitude toward them was far from being completely negative. We only need to look to the book of Exodus, where we find Moses and Aaron intimidating the Pharaoh by turning a staff into a snake. As we read, Aaron threw down his staff before Pharaoh and his officials, and it became a snake. Then Pharaoh summoned the wise men and the sorcerers. Each one threw down his staff, and they became snakes, but Aaron's staff swallowed up theirs. The Jews recognized the enchanting and mysterious, yet uncanny and fearsome qualities of the serpent, and these sentiments were practically universal in the ancient world. When it's described anthropomorphically, as it is in chapter 3, the serpent is said to have been the most cunning of all the wild beasts that God had made. And this is immediately apparent with the first words at its mouth, as it says to Eve, "Did God really say you shall not eat from any tree in the garden?" The serpent uses innuendo to initiate conversation. It symbolizes a worldly wisdom, one of rhetoric and rationalizations. Accordingly, it only appears when Adam and Eve dialogue with the idea of transgressing the boundaries that God has set for them. Eve replies, saying, "We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but of the fruit of the tree that is in the middle of the garden, God said, 'Do not eat it, nor shall you touch it, or you shall die.'" The serpent retorts, saying, "You will not die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." Adam and Eve have no conception of this thing called death, and the serpent is mostly right in predicting the consequences of eating the fruit, for they don't die on the same day that they eat from the tree. For the Lutheran theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, death in this context is not meant in the strict sense of the word, but refers rather to a spiritual death. Death is no longer being able to live and yet having to live in the presence of God. It means to stand before Him outlawed, lost and damned, but not non-existing. The will to live, the inability to live, having to live, that is the living death of the man who is like God. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. And she also gave some to her husband, who was with her, and he ate. Then the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together and made loincloths for themselves. Fig leaves are big, thus illustrating the immensity of the shame they felt before one another. By gaining knowledge of good and evil, we're introduced to the idea that existence may involve disharmony and disunity, and possibly even strife. Hence, the unity of body and spirit is brought into question. They're embarrassed by one another, which is a tragic turn of events considering how they had originally been described as one flesh in chapter 2, a state that God had ordained. We then read that they heard the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden at the time of the evening breeze, and the man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of God among the trees of the garden. Then follows what I would consider to be the saddest line in the story, if not in the entire Bible. The Lord God called to the man and said to him, "Where are you?" It's a rhetorical question. Of course God knows where he is, but he wants Adam to recognize just what has happened. From this moment on, it seems as though there will be a divide between humans and God, between the worldly and the divine. When asked if he had eaten from the tree, Adam tries to defend himself, saying, "The woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me the fruit from the tree, and I ate." Notice Adam implicitly blames God for his own actions. When Eve is asked to explain herself, she says, "The serpent tricked me, and I ate." Neither one of them are able to take responsibility for themselves. God then addressed the serpent, saying, "Because you did this, cursed are you more than all the animals and wild beasts. Upon your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will strike your head, and you will strike his heel." Apparently, the serpent is a creature that originally had limbs in the story. God then addresses Eve, saying, "I will greatly increase your pangs in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children, yet your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you." Man's rule over woman here is a tragic reflection of the disintegration of their original connectedness, and thus the stage is set for gender inequality and the patriarchal dominance of the ancient Jewish nation. Addressing Adam, God says, "Cursed is the ground because of you. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your brow you shall eat bread until you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken. You are dust, and to dust you shall return." It's important to note that in the Hebrew text, the word for Adam's toil in the fields and the word for Eve's excruciating pain in childbearing come from the same root. For Eve, it's be'etzev. For Adam, the word is itzabon. Both of these words come from the Hebrew word atzev, which means to hurt, to pain, or to grieve. Both Adam and Eve must labor in their own way as a result of their actions. So in this sense, they are both cursed equally. Adam and Eve now live in a very different world. In their pursuit of divine knowledge, they have succeeded in becoming like God in knowing good and evil, but to them it is a harrowing distinction, as it sets apart man from woman, mankind from beast, mankind from earth, and above all, mankind from God.